Welcome to Live from Plato's Cave. I am Mario Veen. This is episode 48, Geocentric Worldview with Marcia Bjornerud.
Strange shadows on the wall. Reality is not so real at all. Philosophy invites you to be brave. Welcome to life from Plato's cave.
Marcia Bjornerud is a professor of environmental studies and geosciences at Lawrence University. She's a contributing writer to The New Yorker, Wired, Wall Street Journal and Los Angeles Times. And she's the author of Reading the Rocks and Timefulness, which I discussed with her in episode 5 of this podcast, and of Geopedia. And we spoke about that book in episode 20. So we're speaking about her new book. She's one of the first people I thought when I started this podcast, and I can just invite any authors or anyone I want to speak to. They don't always say yes, but I thought this is one of the first people I want to speak with. And I learned so much from her writing and from speaking to her, and just speaking to her again is great because her new book is really something different. So she writes, with a geocentric worldview, we can see ourselves in miniature, part of a long lineage of creatures on a creative planet that has renewed itself for more than 4 billion years, while keeping an idiosyncratic diary of its activities over time in the form of rocks. And this book, which is called Turning to Stone, Discovering the Subtle Wisdom of the Rocks, is the second book I'm going to discuss in a new series of book reviews that I started. It's called Challenging Time, and it's being published on Future-Based. When it's ready, I will put the link in the description. So I like the back cover of this book, and I'll just read it to you, and then we'll just go straight to my conversation with Marcia. Earth is vibrantly alive and full of wisdom for those who learn to listen. Earth has been reinventing itself for more than 4 billion years, keeping a record of its experiments in the form of rocks. Yet most of us spend our lifetimes on the planet with no idea of its extraordinary history, unable to interpret the language of the rocks that surround us. Geologist Marcia Bjornerud believes that our lives can be enriched by understanding our heritage on this old and creative planet. Contrary to their reputation, rocks have eventful lives, and they intersect with our own in surprising ways. In Turning to Stone, Bjornerud reveals how rocks are the hidden infrastructure that keep the planet functioning. From sandstone aquifers purifying the water we drink to basalt formations slowly regulating global climate. Bjornerud's life as a geologist has coincided with an extraordinary period of discovery in the geosciences. From an insular girlhood in rural Wisconsin, she found her way to an unlikely career studying mountains in remote parts of the world, and witnessed the emergence of a new understanding of the Earth as an animate system of rock, air, water, and life. We are all most fundamentally Earthlings, and we can find existential meaning and enduring wisdom in stone.
Physics, so poetry and art, interdisciplinary start. We will travel, but you're safe. Welcome to life from Plato's cave.
Well, it's so great to speak to you again, Marcia.
Likewise, Mario.
I was just looking back when our first conversation was. That was a little over 3 years ago.
That's hard to believe.
Yeah, it was actually one of the first episodes of this podcast. And we spoke about your book, Timefulness. I work with concepts a lot in interdisciplinary work, and this has been one of my favorite concepts since then, because it's so important concept for our time. And I was wondering, since you wrote that book or since we talked about it, did you have any new insights on timefulness?
Well, it really is my worldview. And in writing the book, I was giving expression to the way I move around the world, seeing it in 4 dimensions, literally as a product of time. but it's been interesting to me since the book came out how many different people from different disciplines, including yourself, have responded to it. Of course, my center of gravity is rocks, but I've talked with historians and philosophers and religious scholars and psychologists, and it's been gratifying to find that it's a concept that people have taken and developed in their own ways. So that really gives me a lot of joy.
Mika Ball, who is studying interdisciplinarity, she said something like, what does it mean to be interdisciplinary? It means that you learn about the field, but you don't get a degree in it. But you need something from it, and you need something from different fields. And it's almost literally what I read in the prologue of your new book, when you say something like, not everyone needs to be a geologist, but there are some geologic habits of mind that are essential to the physical and psychic well-being of humankind. I mean, that's kind of a big statement, right? And the subtitle of Timefulness, I don't know if sometimes the publishers come up with this, but it was like how thinking like a geologist can save the world. I have to say, I probably agree with you, but can you defend that claim that it's not just like, yeah, it would be a good idea if people learn a little bit more about geology? No, you say it's really essential to the physical and psychic well-being of humankind.
I do think so. It's not hyperbole. And there are practical and spiritual reasons that I assert that. I mean, from a practical standpoint, we Earthlings need to understand the planet. Most of the environmental problems that we're facing today have arisen because of ignorance of the intrinsic timescales of natural and geological processes. We are just accelerating things beyond any kind of reasonable level at which the planet can maintain equilibrium. So there are very practical reasons that thinking geologically is important. But more and more, I've come to realize that the malaise that has infected so many Western countries that have reached a privileged level of affluence and yet have growing levels of mental health issues. I think a lot of this stems from some unresolved longing to know ourselves better. And our most fundamental identity, of course, is Earthlings. So understanding where we came from and having a sense of our continuing place on the planet is really, I think, an essential thing for modern society. It seems like a strange claim to make, but I know for myself, as I get older, my ability to read landscapes and rocks just, kind of from the raw record around me is a deeply comforting thing. And so I'm trying to share that with people who haven't necessarily had the privilege of spending many waking hours in the presence of rocks. There are many portals into this way of thinking, and I'm trying to provide some access points for people who might be receptive to that.
I only read the prologue of your book so far, but I have the feeling it's a more personal book than maybe your previous books. Is it a more personal book?
It is more personal, and it took me a while to make peace with the sort of memoir format. I avoided it for a while. My editor had suggested it and had a few false starts. And then finally realized that I could use my own story as someone who has spent most of my adult life thinking about the Earth and the records of the geologic past, and my deepening and more nuanced understanding over 40 years now as just a scaffolding for the larger stories I wanted to tell. Really, in the book, my puny human story is just a kind of framework for these much larger protagonists, the various rocks that I feature in each chapter, each one of which is a kind of large character that in some way governs the way the planet functions. So it is a memoir, but I'm a pretty private person. And so, again, I've used just the kind of outline of my own biography as a way to make it easier for people to get to know these rocks.
Yeah, I really relate to that. We live in a very strange time and we all try to kind of make sense of it, right? And get a grasp of it and bring it down to a level that we can understand. And I'm working on a book as well now. And 1 year I recorded everything related to climate. And after a while, I realized that all these, like the eternal recurrence of the same would always be like a time where no one was talking about climate. Then there would be a time where there was a protest, maybe by Extinction Rebellion, or maybe there was a heat wave. People started to talk about it. And then always there was someone saying, hey, we have this techno fix. What if we block the sun or something like that? And then it would be quiet again. And I started to notice all these rhythms. And why? Yeah, this is a big question, but most people agree that there's a real that we're in a real crisis or emergency or problem or whatever you want to call it, a challenge, a planetary crisis. But it seems we're not paying a lot of attention to it. Do you have any, and you've been doing this for 40 years, and I've been really like actively following all of this for a couple of years. Do you have any explanation why that is? Is that just like how humans are built?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. It's easy to blame our evolutionary hardwiring, I suppose. And there might be some of that, in our distant past, we needed to respond to immediate crisis, evade the predator, and the adrenaline system kicks in when we are under immediate threat. So maybe that's part of it. We just have trouble feeling motivated to act on things that aren't always obvious catastrophes. So as you said, after there's a major heat wave or a terrible flood or a hurricane, people do feel motivated, but there's always sort of a exponential decay of of that level of response. I blame the forces of capitalism and also the infrastructure that we have economically and politically. Many of our institutions just are not designed for long-term planning. Certainly in this country, we are just stuck in this hellish political stalemate these days. And all of the ridiculous bombast that it's hurled back and forth takes up all the discourse. And so there's just not much serious conversation that's going on. But also, and part of the reason I continue to write for popular audiences is that I do think there's some intrinsic ignorance, and some of it's not the fault of ordinary people. They haven't had an opportunity to really learn much about the planet. But some is willful ignorance too, of just wishing that the world were a different kind of place where we could do whatever we wanted to do and the planet wouldn't notice. So unfortunately, I think it's a complicated constellation of things that collectively create paralysis. And so it's not there's not going to be one thing that nudges people into action. We have to kind of act on multiple fronts: economic, political, psychological, spiritual, even.
I see also a parallel between this sense that you describe that you're on a glacier and it feels like when you're on a glacier or on a mountain or something, this has been there forever. But when you bring in this timefulness and you start to study it, you see, well, actually everything is always changing. for me, it's kind of the same feeling with geology, because I was born in the 80s. So I thought that what I learned about tectonic plates in primary school, or about volcanoes, or about climate, that, people have known this for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. So that's one of the things I discovered by reading your work, is that if I learn about physics, all these things happened in 1500, 1600, 1700. And then you say, well, actually now we are living in the golden age of geology. It's very young science in that sense.
Yes, absolutely. And I think people don't realize it. I know here in the US, geology has kind of a musty reputation. People associate it just with static collections of gems and minerals in museums, or maybe dinosaurs and various displays. But this is the golden age of understanding the planet. We finally have the tools that we need to really be able to envision the planet in 4 dimensions over deep time. So we have geochemical techniques, isotopic methods, computer simulation capacity, real-time monitoring of plate motions and climate variables from satellites. And so, yeah, we have bigger data sets, we have better computational capacity, we have more sophisticated understanding of how to read geochemical clues in rocks than we ever have before. And when I look back on my own career, it's kind of astonishing to contrast the sorts of scientific papers that were coming out in the early 80s when I first started in the field with those today. The sophistication, the level of sophistication is just exponentially higher. But sadly, we're not necessarily doing the best job of communicating all of these new insights to, earthlings who could put some of this knowledge to use. So that's the challenge of the modern geosciences, I think, is really application of this new view of the planet that we've gained over the last few decades.
And is that broader than just saying climate science? Because now in the news, when people hear about science, they hear, oh, there's a climate crisis going on. Sometimes they hear more about also an ecological crisis. And then if you're lucky, they don't interview an economist or a businessman or something. They interview a scientist, and then there's usually a climate scientist. Is that enough? Or is climate science, if you say climate scientist, can I assume this is someone who knows about the geologic past of the Earth and all those kind of things that you describe as well?
Usually, yeah. I mean, the one thing that has really happened again in my career is that the boundaries between geology and other allied fields like climatology have become more permeable. And there's this understanding that we need to be looking at records of the past, but then also looking at present day just meteorological data as we build models for how the climate's going to be in the future. So most climate scientists are quite conversant with geologic records of past climate as well as predictions of future climate. And that's a really healthy thing. I mean, this kind of reintegration of the earth sciences began with the plate tectonic revolution. Geology between the time of Darwin, say, when it was kind of one discipline, natural history, it began to fragment into sub-disciplines, people who studied rocks, people who studied minerals, people who collected fossils, people who studied landforms. And so geology was really splintering for a century. And then the plate tectonic revolution in the mid-60s and into the mid-70s brought people back together again. And ever since then, I think that the discipline has become just habitually more connected. And that's been hugely important because the Earth doesn't recognize these artificial boundaries between subdisciplines.
I interviewed your colleague Stephen Porter 2 episodes ago. I think you even wrote a blurb for his book, Elemental.
Yep.
It's one of my favorite books now. It's just like a different way of telling the story again, right? In terms of these world-changing organisms and the elements of life. So really from also a chemical perspective. My conversation with him was, I was very hopeful at the end as well, because, I mean, we do have to acknowledge the seriousness of the problems, but he was also saying, yeah, but change can also happen fast. And we don't need to know everything. We just need to, basically, we all need to get to work. I guess that's also the frustrating part, where we notice that not everyone is paying 100% attention to this and doing what they can, because that's the first step, right? But if, yeah, maybe the question is, imagine that like suddenly in Dutch, we say the quarter drops. I don't know if that is an English expression.
The penny drops.
The penny drops. And it's like a little bit like similar to Corona. When they started, everyone said, oh, we all need to work on a vaccine. And pretty quickly there was a vaccine. So if we would have the same kind of attention, that everyone would start to work on the climate crisis, study on geology, kind of utopian, right? Doing all the things that you want. What do you think is the area of geosciences that you would say, okay, this is where you have to throw a lot of research money at, because this is where, we can discover maybe something that could help us?
I think it probably would be into biogeochemistry, which is really what Steve Porter's book is all about. The really intricate, multi-level, entwined ways that different elements cycle through the Earth system. And we're only at the very beginning of really comprehending the complexity of that. I think we're kind of where plate tectonics was in the 70s, really, with biogeochemistry. And I think that's and these biogeochemical cycles of sulfur and carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus are happening partly on true human timescales. They're also really long, slow parts of these cycles. But I think, yeah, if we could really deeply invest in understanding there, we might be able to come up with some good ways of harnessing some of them to ameliorate things that we've done to the biogeochemical world. It's not my field, but I think that would be one. Closer to my own work, I study plate tectonics and increasingly earthquakes, the record of earthquakes in the deep crust, for better understanding of what's actually going on during an earthquake. And it's just shocking to me that people still die in the tens of thousands during major earthquakes. At this point, we should have ways of engineering earthquake-proof, affordable housing for people all over the world. And that to me is a humanitarian priority. And we know enough about the nature of seismic events and the risk in different parts of the world. There's just no reason at this point, given the sophistication of seismology, that people are still vulnerable. I think the largest earthquakes, magnitude 9, are difficult to engineer for, but there is no reason that people should be perishing in magnitude 6 or 7 earthquakes.
Yeah, like in Turkey, it happened not so long ago, and I saw some reports that basically nothing is happening yet in terms of reconstructing it in a safe way.
Yeah, it's political corruption and gridlock, and it takes investment as well. But yeah, it's really immoral. That's a place where we have the scientific understanding and we just need to implement it.
Yeah, agreed. Reading this book, it brings together very nicely some of the previous things I've been studying. So Stephen Porter's book was very interesting, but we're still talking a little bit on more like a scientific level of we have to understand the planet and what can we do, and like human beings are the engineers or the ones that can work with that. The other episode, which is probably going to be the one before this, is about a book called Sad Planets. and it investigates what's sometimes being called the pathetic fallacy, and it means that we ascribe feelings to objects in the world, like saying like, oh, my cat is sad, or a planet can be sad, and it's kind of really nuancing this and looking at how we're so used to saying, well, feelings and thoughts and intentions and language is something very human and it happens inside our head. But it's more, I can't explain it very shortly, but it really connected to what you wrote about the intimacy that you feel with, so in this case, being on a glacier, saying that rocks have personalities, saying that the landscape is alive. And at one point you describe how, children, of course, this comes natural to children. For them, everything is alive. They can play. I have a 7-year-old daughter. It doesn't matter. She can play with rocks and everything. And then you describe that you became a scientist and you learned, of course, to take distance. And, we are studying the kind of the objects outside of us. But now you have a different message about that, right? The quote I'm referring to is, the terrain was animate, sentient, and creative. It would just take me 30 years to say it out loud.
Yeah, I'm playing with a dangerous dichotomy here. Of course, anthropomorphization or anthropomorphism is generally a taboo in science for the reasons you were saying. The idea that if we project ourselves onto the natural world, then we may be filtering out things that don't have good parallels with human behaviors or attributes. But I think you can go too far with that and can also miss essential attributes of nature if we assume a priori that we have nothing in common with a natural phenomenon. My view is that, of course, we see resonances between ourselves and the natural world because we are children of the natural world. We shouldn't assume that the human perspective is the only one, but it is a perspective that has grown up with nature. And so I think we need to find a middle way between, the so-called objectivity of Western science, which I argue is just a pose anyway. I don't think true objectivity has ever been achieved. And then on the other hand, being too sure that we can read the minds of inanimate objects. But as I said in that prologue to the book, I have come round after these decades in the field to understanding that in some way, the earth and even the seemingly mute rocks are communicative and sentient in the sense that they're interacting with us in real time. They're responding to modern atmospheric chemistry, to the chemistry of waters that flow over them. They're changing and in conversation with the present day. They're not just lumps that are not noticing the changes around them. So in some way, maybe it's a metaphor, but the boundary between metaphor and reality is a little slippery. I would say that rocks are, they're in some way communicative and aware.
Science uses metaphors all the time to understand stuff. So when we talk about gravitational waves, it's not an actual wave. The wave is a metaphor. And there are so many different ways of using kind of imagery to kind of get our head around the world that we live in.
Yeah, we need those images. Absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe we don't need to. I guess it's kind of depends on your spiritual worldview if you would say, oh, this tree or this stone is actually sentient. But you could also say maybe it's part of the scientific attitude that we use ourselves as an instrument to understand the world. There's several ways I can go with this. Yeah, so this reminds me again of an earlier episode. Do you know by any chance the book The Natural Contract by Michel Serres?
No, I don't.
In a nutshell, he's saying, well, you know, the social contract. So that's the contract between human beings, the United Nations, international cooperation. And Michel Serres went to the UN in the 1990s, and he said, yeah, it's nice you're all sitting there and deciding stuff, but where are the trees and where are the rocks and where are the objects? And so he's also speaking in these kind of terms of, for instance, an image of a natural contract is a rock climber who attaches the rope to the rock, and that's kind of your contract with the mountain. Yeah, and then the rights of nature movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are, for me, those are very hopeful developments. And the rights of nature movement is also a movement that acknowledges that it's not that, we grant rights to nature, but nature already has inherent rights to thrive and to,
All of these things, I think, are wonderful antidotes to what I see as one of the great pathologies of our time, which is narcissism, whether it's at the personal level or the societal level. Thinking that we are the center of everything. And if we can decenter ourselves through these ways of thinking, that's a big step forward.
Do you have any examples of times when something happened in your personal life that helped you understand some aspect of geology, or maybe the other way around, that studying geology helped you with something in your personal life?
Quite a few. Let me think. I mean, certainly my experiences in the high Arctic, both in Svalbard and in Arctic Canada and Ellesmere Island, were formative for me. I started going there in my 20s, and at a time when these places were really beyond reach of any kind of telecommunication, especially. And the feeling of absolutely being on our own in a small camp of, say, 3 or 4 people for an entire summer, and really needing to be able to read the landscape and the weather and keep on the lookout for polar bears, deeply affected my psyche. It permanently convinced me that nature is firmly in charge, and any thoughts to the contrary are completely delusional. So certainly that having those experiences as a young adult absolutely changed me, and I'm very grateful for them. On the other hand, just the human interactions, the people I've worked with as a geologist in different parts of the world, some in remote places, some in urban places, that has been really important to me too, showing how there can be real intimacy between people that comes out of the study of nature and the sustained attention to things outside ourselves. And I really value those relationships. They're not romantic relationships. They've been with people who I probably would not have interacted with socially, but I have really strong, close relationships with people of different generations and different cultures because of our shared curiosity about the way the earth works. So I think, yeah, it goes both ways, that rocks and the natural environment have exerted their power over my thinking. But then also there's been this interesting human benefit that has come from spending so much time obsessing over how rocks get deformed and how mountains grow.
What are some of the geologic habits of mind that non-geologists can benefit from?
Well, I think the sense that everything is in motion, that the world that we know is just one version of the world. And that can be intimidating. We don't want to see the familiar environment that we cherish and that we share with people we know fade away. But if we can just make peace with that, we'll save ourselves a lot of anxiety and sorrow. That is just the nature of things. If we think we would like things to be static, then we should just, look to the moon or Mars, where there's nothing that has ever changed. That's a very sterile world. It is just in the nature of the world to evolve and transmogrify into new forms. Interestingly, there's been a movement in mineralogy, which is probably the most kind of neat and tidy and sterile sub branch within the geosciences, to acknowledge that minerals too have evolved. I don't know if you've heard of this idea of mineral evolution.
No, tell me more.
Yeah. So, and it's true that if you look at Venus and Mars or the moon, say, there's really a rather impoverished inventory of different minerals and rock types because there are just very few processes going on in those worlds. But then if you look at Earth and Earth through time, because there are just so many agents interacting with each other, water, and of course, eventually life in different forms, Earth has invented thousands of minerals that probably do not exist anywhere else, certainly in our solar system and maybe beyond. So this idea that change is bad or something to be dreaded, if we can just let go of that and understand that this is the way of things and that Earth is a phenomenally creative and innovative and exuberant place, and that it's constantly inventing new things, that's kind of a different perspective. And again, I just think the sense of feeling grounded, the logic of the earth, knowing why things are the way they are. It's not arbitrary. There's a story there. Maybe that doesn't matter to everyone, but to me, there's just this great satisfaction like, oh, I recognize you, Hill. You're a moraine. You were left there 10,000 years ago by a tongue of ice. And there's something, then I understand where I am. So I just wish for people that they had more access to that kind of understanding.
Physics and astronomy kind of have this patent or a monopoly on this sense of wonderment to realize how small we are, a speck of dust in the universe. But I had I've been walking around for weeks just like thinking about when I discovered, wow, land plants haven't been around for really so long. And there was a time that there were no land plants. And well, this is Stephen Porter's book as well, right? Like, and when they came onto Earth, it just changed the entire world and it changed the climate. And but just to realize, like, wow, these plants that seem like they have been there forever, but they have not. They haven't been there for most of the time that the Earth was there. Yeah, and it's not something that I can use or apply in my life, but I do feel it adds something to my life.
Yeah, I often say that people walk around like bad tourists on the planet. That they're enjoying the hospitality, but they really have no clue about the culture or the language. And sure, you can visit a place and be a kind of superficial visitor that way, but your experience is just so much more enriched if you do have a sense of the history and the practices and the language.
Yeah, I really like that analogy as well, because so I showed you my podcast studio and it's just like a phone resting on a pile of books. Mm-hmm. And one of the books is Vincent van Gogh's Diaries.
Oh.
And it's maybe the difference between many people, they come to Amsterdam or another museum and they want to see his painting, The Sunflowers, or want to see the Mona Lisa or another painting. And you just go and you say, well, I saw the painting and that's it. But if you know a little bit more about his life and how he painted those paintings and the thoughts it adds so much more than just looking at the painting.
Yeah, and there is some sort of communication across time that happens, I think, that you can't speak with Van Gogh, but in some way you're entering into his world and engaging with him across the decades.
Yeah, that's what. So this is what I'm writing about. Actually, my book starts with the activist throwing soup at the painting of Van Gogh, and of course, which is like people you can, why would people do that? But then if I think about Van Gogh, he was, so he painted, one of the drawings is of the, how do you say that? Gas factory in Den Haag. So he was kind of alive he was living at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And that kind of, makes it more palpable for me. Anyway, we're not here to talk about my stuff. There's another, so there's this like this, the intimacy and entering into a relationship with the earth and with the rocks. That is maybe going against the grain a little bit of what you hear most of the time in science. And the other part I really liked is that sometimes people talk about these ego bruises to humankind, like Darwin, and we discover we're not the center of the universe. And one of the examples they always use is, we used to have a geocentric worldview, but we've evolved from that because then Copernicus, and then we realized, the Earth is not the center of the universe. And you say, I'm going to write this book showing you my geocentric worldview. That was very nice as well, I think. But so do you think we should go back to a geocentric worldview?
Well, of course, I'm using it not in the sense of the center of the universe, but this is where we live. And so why shouldn't we be focused on this amazing, verdant planet? And another change that I have seen in my 40 years in geoscience is this kind of return to geocentrism, if we want to call it that. When I was a student, I remember textbooks having the sort of tendency to emphasize that Earth was just one among, many planets in a galaxy that had many stars, and there's nothing particularly special about the Earth. But as we began to have more data from our near neighbors in space, Venus and Mars and the moons of Jupiter, and then the discovery of exoplanets outside the solar system, it's been really interesting to see the implied portrayal of the Earth within the scientific literature shifting to saying, ooh, Earth is strange and peculiar and really quite remarkable. And I, of course, I agree. But this is coming in even to relatively technical literature. I was just reading a paper the other day in the Journal of Geophysical Research about the likelihood of plate tectonics on other rocky planets, both planets we know of and, exoplanets that we only have very little information about. And the conclusion was that plate tectonics is really an unusual habit for a planet to develop. It takes a very particular combination of conditions and water and time. It's not going to happen on a planet that is orbiting a star that has a short lifetime. And, I think that's really interesting that there's this sense that Earth is unusual and worthy of reverence just because it is such an odd thing. And so many different kinds of attributes have had to come together to make it the place that we know. So, geocentrism is I think, maybe making a comeback.
Why do you call it, you write that it's a philosophical and even spiritual worldview?
Well, for some of the reasons that we've talked about, that it changes our sense of who we are. It shifts humans from the center of everything to participants. I think that there's a middle way. We don't have to just feel that our egos have been assaulted by acknowledging that we're not the center of everything. It's comforting to me to know that we are part of this much larger, robust, resilient, reliable Earth system. I would be terrifying if we were in charge of everything. Having no adults in the room. And so, I think for practical and spiritual, philosophical reasons, people need to come back to some sense of planetary citizenship.
Yeah, I asked the same question to Stephen Porter and actually to all the scientists I speak that study this kind of stuff. Have you become more hopeful or less hopeful over, let's say, the last decade?
Hmm. Hmm. It's hard to say. Maybe more hopeful. Finally, I think the messages that we've been drumming into people for so long are part of the public discourse, and changes is being implemented, not as fast as it needs to be. But I feel like there has been some kind of breaking of complete impasse, and the markets, frankly, are, people are realizing green energy is good business. Um, so I think change is coming. People have woken up, but there's also a sense of malaise and despair that I think is frightening. I see it in my students. It's such a tightrope to walk, to simultaneously convey the urgency of things, but not leave them in a complete state of
Not
paralysis.
becoming a doomster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah, I'm interested in this part about I do workshops sometimes and so about climate and I use the format of the bad news conversation that maybe you notice from doctors use this, like there's a kind of format in which we know works if you have a diagnosis to give to a patient. You give the diagnosis, but then you give room to whatever thoughts and feelings come up, and then you work basically before you start to talk about treatments or possible solutions. You kind of work with them through these kind of stages of grief or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not the only one. I think many people are doing that. But then I always say, if there are people, so there's a difference between people who are optimistic. I say before their oh shit moment and after their oh shit moment. So if you're optimistic, it can kind of be trying to avoid the bad news. Oh, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe it will be okay. Or really like kind of taking in the bad news and really feeling it in your bones and going through the despair and everything like that. And then thinking, oh yeah, okay, but now what? Because it's never too late to prevent worse. So what am I going to do now? And sometimes I see people, maybe is that kind of what you're describing, that you become so overwhelmed with the reality check, because I think that's what it is, that you think, it doesn't matter anyway what I do. So why do anything? Do you recognize that in your own life, or have you always had this kind of spirit of, okay, we need to keep working on this?
No, I do see that in my own trajectory. And I think it's I like your approach. We need to let people process in their own way. And strangely, the structure of my book is a bit like that too. I start with, childhood and, a relatively simple, happy time. And then I had some real struggles in my 30s. My husband at the time became very sick and died. And then I had three small children. And I went through a difficult time. And in the book, I use rocks that I was studying at the time as kind of an analog to my own psychological state, that I went deep underground and in fact was studying rocks that were formed and deformed, at great depths in the crust. And then in the later chapters of the book, I start coming back to the surface again, and the rocks I'm studying are also closer to the surface.
Like Plato's cave. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think many people's lives have that kind of trajectory, that at some point you confront something that is either going to completely sink you, or you just find some way of getting up every day and going on. And if possible, you've gleaned something, some lesson or some insight from it, and you emerge on the other side and you're ready to go on. So, yeah, I think that's a very wise way of approaching the climate crisis and not just continually pummeling people with doomsday predictions. But, fine, okay, what do we do now?
No. Well, I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of the book, and I actually hope you write many more books because... So here's why. I'm trying to find the right analogy. I can't really find the right one, but we talked before about science communication, and there's been a lot of science communication around physics. But the science communication around physics is like, wow, there's this amazing black hole, and you know what, time is relative, and it's wow, this is so amazing. But then, of course, geology comes along. Most people, is starting to enter people's life, and they start to hear about geology topics. But it's always stuff that makes them depressed. Like, oh, did you know about the climate? It's going to be 1.5, 2 degrees, and society is going to collapse, and this and that. So then I think, yeah, it's maybe like a Pavlov's dog response, like, oh yeah, I don't want to find out more about geology because it just makes me so depressed. And that's why I do like books like from Kimberly Nicholas and all these other climate scientists, and Bill McKibben, of course, that really communicate that part of the story. But I really like what you do as well, is because you give the bigger picture, and it's not, you also describe those kind of things that, land plants haven't been always around, or did you know that ice is also technically a kind of rock? Is it clear what I'm trying to get at? It's like, there's so much other stuff about geology that may be very nice to hear, and it doesn't have those sad feelings associated with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, physics shouldn't have a corner on the sort of awe and wonder and beauty in the cosmos. There are so many beautiful stories and phenomena in the geological realm as well. So the narrative should not be simply what we've done to this beautiful planet. We need to celebrate its resilience and remarkable long biography.
Well, thank you so much. This is the third time we speak. I hope we get to speak another time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mario.
Everything we see and seem is but a dream within a dream. Strange